Hello and welcome to another episode of LGOtv Big Talk. And why Big Talk? Because I hate small talk. So my guest today, and you heard that right, guests too. I have two guests today, are Jason and Diana Kander. Now, you may recognize Jason's name because he ran for president in 2016. His wife, Diana, is somebody who I have come to know through the author and the speaking world. I actually supported Jason in his campaign in 2016, but he didn't win, came very close. I hope that he'll come back. But his book that is coming out today is called Invisible Storm. And it's actually all about him coming back, dropping out of that race, and seeking help for PTSD. So I want to get right into this. I want to have this conversation. The reason Diana is here also is that throughout this book, she also adds her comments, her thoughts about how what was happening to him was affecting her and the family. So we're going to talk to both of them about this experience. Now, Jason, I'm so thrilled that you're here. And I know that your book starts with you walking into the VA and being put on suicide watch. But I started this show with the idea of interviewing people for my next book, which is going to be called Wonder Hell. And it's about that moment when you've realized this is amazing, this is exciting, it's wonderful. I'm meant for more. Oh my God, it's wonderful. And also, I've never been so exhausted and full of stress and doubt and anxiety and uncertainty in my entire life. It's kind of hell. So I don't want to start in that moment of the suicide watch. I want to start in the moment that you realize that you were made for more. And we can start when that's like back when you wanted to play professional baseball. We can talk about the day you walked into the ROTC office. We can talk about the meeting with President Obama when he said you should run for president. I'll let you talk about any one of your Wonder Hell moments, but I'd love to start there.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start with the one that's not in the book.
Ooh.
Yeah. So you were saying a minute ago, I knew what you meant. I think you meant when I ran for Senate in 2016.
That's what I meant. Yes.
It's totally fine. I mentioned it because for the context of this story, because then I end up getting ready to run for president in 2020. But
Because you came so close.
Right.
So close.
And I appreciate the support. And so the story I was going to share was, I remember after that Senate race in 2016, when Hillary had lost my state by 19, and we had come within 3 points of winning on the same day. And then like a couple weeks after that, and at that point I was like unsure whether I was still going to be a part of things at all, like whether anybody wanted, after you lose, like do you get kicked to the curb or what happens. And as I get into in the book, like I also at that point was struggling with undiagnosed, untreated PTSD. So like I didn't feel like I could handle not constantly moving and constantly doing things. So it was a scary moment for me. And I was invited by the Democratic Senate caucus to come to Washington and to talk about lessons learned, because I had won more votes from people who had voted for Trump, despite my being a progressive, than really anybody, including the people who had won their elections. And I remember being in that room, and I may have alluded to this in the book, but I remember being in that room, and there's people who are in the U.S. Senate there. There's people who are about to be because they just won their races, and there's me. And it was just one of those moments where I sort of looked around and I was like, I may not have won, but I just had this feeling like I could hang in here. Like I would have done fine here. And that was, for better or worse, that drove me to say like, no, I'm not going to depart from the path that I was on. I don't know if that's what you had in mind, but that's the sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, and you talk in the book about you tell a very funny story in an incredibly humble way about walking into a meeting with President Obama, where you were like, you thought it'd be like a 15-minute meeting, you'd be in, you'd be out, and then he sits down and you talk for like 5 minutes about ties and suits, and you're like, this is not a quick brush off meeting. And by the end of the meeting, he's telling you that he thinks you should run for president.
Yeah, he was at least encouraging of the idea. I mean, he was realistic about it, right? Like he was running through with me like all of the, hurdles that I would have to overcome. But the most important part, and really the only place where I quoted him in the book, because I wanted to be respectful as well, is when he said to me, look, you have what I had. You're the natural. And what he was saying is like, you have the raw skill set, and it's not, he was basically telling me it's not crazy. Like, and I think after that, there were probably a handful of campaigns that benefited from like his full mentorship, but or budding campaigns at that point, and ours was one of them. And so it was a strange mix for me, right? Because here I was, like, my political hero had given me this gift, this validation. Um, and at the same time, I was still struggling with night terrors and hypervigilance and all of these symptoms of PTSD that were kind of eating me up. But I had just been fueled by this validation, this external validation that I most certainly felt I needed at that moment.
So one of the things about Wonder Hell is that like the hell part of it is the burden of potential, right? Like
Sure.
you know that you can do more, you see that you can do more, you feel that you can do more, and now your hero has told you that you can do more, right? And at the same time, you strike me as somebody who has always had this, I am responsible for making sure everybody around me is great and safe and can achieve all they can achieve. I think
Yeah.
that also may be part of, what attracted you to Diane in the first place, because Diana, I know that you also have that same outlook in life. So when you feel that burden, is when he says that to you, you're like, yeah, okay, I could do this. Like, do you go home and say to Diana, are you up for it? Are we going to do this? What do you think? Or are you still I'm sort of wondering where in the, like, is there denial in you about what's happening in terms of your mental health? Or is Diana seeing it? Are you starting to talk about it? Or is it still something that you're just like, it's just pushed down, it's repressed, it's not part of the conversation yet?
I think the answer is yes to all of those things. You want to maybe
No, no, you got
take
it.
that one? Yeah, I mean, at that point, I'm still denying the idea to myself, let alone to the rest of the world, that what I had was PTSD, because the story I had been telling myself for at that point about 9 years, or I guess no, about 10 years at that point, was that, what I did didn't count. Because, for context, for those watching, my job as an Army intelligence officer over there was to go into meetings that were scary meetings that I might not get out of, and to go out over the road, with a translator, but practically by myself. And it was very high risk, but I never fired my weapon. And so the story I'd been telling myself for a long time was, well, I had meetings, that doesn't count as combat. And uh, and so that combined with, the one thing that never flagged for whatever reason, and maybe credit my parents for this, is my entirely outsized confidence in my own professional abilities. While I, had serious doubts about myself as a human being, because that's, it turns out, uh, a common symptom of people who have experienced trauma. I was damn sure that I was the best at what I did, whether that was justified or not. That's how I felt.
Mm.
So to have President Obama say something to me that validated that, it wasn't that it validated my confidence in my abilities as a political performer. What it validated for me, or what it, rebutted for me, was the story I was telling myself, that I was an irredeemable human because I hadn't done enough for my country. I hadn't done enough compared to other people who had served. And so to have him say that gave me some fuel to argue back against that part of myself for a little while.
So, Diana, when Jason came back, was he expressing some of these things? I didn't fire my weapon. I wasn't, a quote unquote real soldier, or whatever the doubts were. Did you start to see some of these even real time, or once it became clear that it was PTSD, did you start to sort of connect the dots backwards and realize that it had been there?
I mean, it took us, 11 years to figure it out. So
And
looking
for
back,
context, I should say for people listening, the two of you met when you were 17. Your
yeah,
first date was Jason's senior prom. So you've known each other a long time. You didn't just meet when he came back from war. You've known each other a long time.
you'd think you'd be able to pick it up, but you'd be wrong. PTSD is very, very sneaky that way. And it, looking back, it's so obvious. Now we watch movies and we're like, oh, that person definitely has some PTSD. Or we could just see what's happening to the character and be like, they should really talk to someone after this
Yes.
intense situation. But at the time, it was like, well, this person is different than they used to be. And they're different because, they're very scared of the world, or they're very angry. And so you don't necessarily tie those things to the trauma that they went through at all.
Right. Right.
And
Well, and there's a really interesting what I love in the book where, Jason will tell what's happening, and then you respond with sort of what was going on, and you say, that you've always been somebody who jumps in and helps. And you're like, I jumped in and I started swimming in the ocean, and you have a line that said, and I started drowning too. And did you notice that, Jason, that Diana was being affected by it, or you were so in the weeds probably?
That was the thing I noticed the least of everything. To me, so for context, Diana was beginning to exhibit the same symptoms as me despite not having the underlying trauma. But that's not how I saw it at the time, right? Because those symptoms were hypervigilance, feeling like, we and our family were in danger, and that sort of thing. And to me at the time, somebody who saw the world as a very dangerous place, I didn't see it as like she was exhibiting the same symptoms as me, because I didn't think I had symptoms. I thought everybody else was completely naive to how dangerous the world was.
Right.
And that, finally my wife was starting to see what I could see, and that would help us protect ourselves and our kid and everything. And so it was more like I was constantly trying to drag her along so she could make some sense. So it was really more like, and then, she wasn't always down for it, right? She wasn't always like interested in putting a helmet on the kid for every darn thing in the world or whatever I was doing. And so it was more like I thought I was just married to this completely unreasonable person. So for me, like finding out, I have PTSD, these are symptoms, and I've given them to her too, it was like an M. Night Shyamalan level twist for me to learn that.
Yeah, and it's funny because, at the same time, it's not like the two of you are just like hanging out, going to your 9 to 5 jobs. You are on a national stage. You're getting a lot of attention. So it would feel, my only experience with this is that I once got a hit piece written on me in the Washington Examiner, and then that was picked up by Ann Coulter, who put it out to like 2 million people on Twitter, and then that was retweeted by Herman Cain. So I had 3 weeks of death threats and rape threats and all kinds of ugly stuff because she said I was an anti-Christian white male hater, which, I'm married to a Christian male, so go figure that out. But at the same time, it made me the enemy of a lot of people. It also made me the most interesting person at the cocktail party for a lot of other people.
Yeah.
But it was terrifying. And there were a couple weeks where I was like, should I pull my kids out of school? I'm not really sure. Somebody retweeted a picture of one of my sons and who happens to be gay. And they were like, this woman is this liberal progressive is turning her kids into ladyboys. And I wanted to be like, joke's on you. I'm already halfway there. But I didn't respond. But for 3 weeks, I was like, what do I do? What do I do? This is terrifying. So to be in that space, magnified by like 10 billion, which I'm sure is what you guys were in, it would feel normal to be a little neurotic and a little worried and a little, I've got eyes in the back of my head. So I could easily see where you would never even, you were like, okay, we're on a national stage. She should feel this way. That's quote unquote normal.
That's what I thought.
Smart.
Yeah.
But I would just say not as
that's
much.
what I thought then. It's not what I think now.
Not as much, but we're still very much on a national stage, but we receive the information in a different way.
Yeah, like we look, we have the tools now to process what's real. For me in particular, one of the things I learned in therapy is that, because I was in Afghanistan, because I was constantly in these situations where I was having to assess the threat, count the doors, where they are, how many guys between me and the vehicle, all that stuff, it changed my brain chemistry. And I know that now. And I know that what it means is that given that I've, I know something most Americans thankfully don't, which is what it's like to prepare yourself to take a life and what it's like to think that you might be about to be killed violently. And as a result of that, my brain was sort of rewired to take every possible threat. And it didn't even have to be a physical threat necessarily. It could be a threat to my career. It could be anything that I needed to control that I wasn't currently controlling, and sort of dial it all the way up to 10. And for me, 10 was getting killed, as a threat. And so that meant things like on election nights when all the work was done and all you could do was sit around and wait for the results to come in, and I had no control over the situation, I quite literally felt like I was dying. But now I know all that stuff, right? And so as a result, I can triage threats and I can triage stress with the knowledge that, okay, that may feel initially like this, but I know that's not really what it is. I'm simplifying it, but that's
no, I it's interesting on a different level, and I'm not going to do the things that people do where I'm like, on a much smaller level, I'm not worthy, because I know that's not going to do that.
Yeah.
When, as Diana does, I make my living traveling to events and speaking on big stages. And suddenly with the pandemic, there were no events and no travel and no big stages. And I came to a stop, a complete and total stop. And that was the moment that for the very first time in my life, I couldn't just keep going and keep going and keep going and collecting the next trophy and the next trophy and the next trophy. And suddenly I sat still. And you sit still, and all of a sudden, all the demons that you're out running catch up to you, and they sit at the table with you, and they're like, "Let's have a meal." And I know more people, speaker authors, people who travel a ton for work than I can count on my fingers and my toes who had exactly the same experience. And I'm sure that happened to a lot of people at the beginning of the pandemic, where suddenly everything that we were and all the movement that we used to hide and to sort of outrun the conversation we didn't want to have suddenly was like, boom, right there, right in your face. And you have to deal with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
we chose like a very healthy way to deal with it, which is work. There are other less healthy ways to deal with it, which are drugs and alcohol. And anything that's actually healthy, you can use in a negative way to numb things. So for instance, I used meditation to numb all of the things that I was going. So meditation is good, but if you're using it to hide from, if you're just using it as a stress management tool and not to avoid the things that are actually happening, it can be a numbing tool. So I think we're just a lot more like, we can just see it much better now and force ourselves to have those difficult conversations much more frequently.
Well, I think it's fascinating, the overlap of former addicts and ultra marathon runners.
Oh yeah, look, it's all, what I've learned in therapy is it's all avoidance, right?
Yes.
It's dealer's choice on your avoidance strategy. So like for me, I spent 11 years, I'm not even figuratively, kind of literally trying to outrun PTSD and depression. And so, one of the conclusions, one of the sort of the lessons that we have in the book as a takeaway is that you can't outrun it. You can't avoid it. The only way out is through. And I know that because if you could outrun PTSD and depression, like I would have, because nobody was running faster than me for that 11 years. But at the end of the day, you just got to turn around and you got to fight it. That's the only thing that actually works. So, yeah.
I'd love to talk a little bit about this idea that you talk about in the book about not being worthy, right? Of feeling like I'm not worthy. I wasn't worthy of being a soldier. I didn't fire my weapon. Do I really have PTSD? Like, I think that happens a lot, where people are, we compare ourselves to other people. Somebody's always got it harder, and we feel badly complaining. We feel badly being there. Last year, I was very, very sick and almost didn't make it through the year. And once I was better, once I was in remission, I was fine from the neck down. But from the neck up, I was like, what? Why can't I get okay? Why can't I get right? And I went to go talk to a shrink, and he was like, "You've got PTSD." And I was like, "No, I don't have PTSD. I didn't go to war." And I spent probably a month being like, "No, I don't need to do any therapy for that. What are you talking about? Take medication, ketamine. I don't need to do any of that stuff." And then he finally convinced me when I basically just could not form sentences any longer. But I think a lot of people, I mean, your book talks about, it's a memoir from politics and from war, but PTSD is really applicable to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's a reason that I wanted to make sure that the part where I go into the Army and where I deploy is the first 2 chapters. And then after that, I happen to be pursuing the presidency, but really I'm just a guy a guy who's in a very busy career while also trying to not lose like his mind in his marriage, which I think a lot of people will relate to. And because look, I know that not everybody is interested in reading, the same kind of books that like my dad reads, books about war, books, whatever. So, there's a little of that in there, but mostly it's a book about a marriage and about a mental health journey. And to your point, we have a tendency, I think, particularly as Americans, to think that what we're trying to find for ourselves is perspective when we compare ourselves to other people's, difficulties, and then we try and rank our trauma out of existence, but it doesn't work. In my case, the version of it that I experienced was the Army. The day you get there, they're basically letting you know that whatever you're doing is no big deal and everybody else has it worse, which is a necessary thing in that job, because if they don't do that, I'm not going to keep going into meetings with people who might want to cut my head off on YouTube, right? and I got to go into those meetings so I can get that information as an intelligence officer and bring it back. But when I'm done with the Army, nobody says, by the way, that was some crazy stuff. You're probably going to need some help. And then to make this answer extra long, the last part of it that I'll tell you that I think affects all of us is there's a part of the American myth that wraps up the idea of recovery from trauma in redemption. And what we are taught through like every dang movie is that if something bad happens to you and you're having trouble getting over it, the way to get past it is to do some heroic act of redemption.
So we're running and running and running again.
Yeah, and exactly. And that's what I believed. And so my most recent example for this is like, I love both Top Gun movies. They're great. All right. And I don't want to, if it's 40 years, so people have probably seen the first one. I'm not spoiling it. Like when Goose dies, they're like, hey, Maverick, like 5 minutes later, they're like, you got to get over it. And then what does he do? He goes into a battle and he saves somebody and he's fine. And it's like, great movie. Love the movies. But that ain't how it works. That doesn't make you better. But that's what we're taught over and over again. When the truth is you got to confront your stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm sure you know Josh Mance, who was an Army captain also in Afghanistan. He died and was brought back to life. He was dead for 15 full minutes in the green zone, and he became a friend of mine because we both volunteered to speak at an Army base in Japan about to help soldiers with their resumes and their career plans when they go into civilian life. And when I first met him, I was like, wow, I'm like, oh my God, you must have been through a lot of therapy after that. I mean, you died. And he was like, no. I was like, do you think maybe you should? And by this point he had, but he had all the same stuff, the survivor guilt and the shame and the spiral that you talk about in the book. But the way that he initially tried to get past it was to like type A this thing. Right. So he lost his career in the Army, the only career he ever loved and ever wanted. So he joined Tesla, fastest growing, company in the world. And he just was like, I'm going to out meditate people. I'm going to out, work people. I'm going to out whatever the thing is. And the suicidal thoughts, and it all just got worse and worse and worse and worse until he finally just hit rock bottom. But it's the same thing. I think he came back thinking, well, if I had this career and it was all about praise and the next big thing that I was going to do that made me a hero again, what do I do now that there's no framework of how do I do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know him. I'd love to know him. It sounds like we'd have a lot to talk about.
Yes. So. And for a while he was going to run for office, and he was living in California, then he was living in Nevada, but he's from sort of the western of Pennsylvania. And I was like, you need to run. Literally, who's going to vote against the dead guy? Like, you literally died for your country. Like, if that's not perfect, I can already see your campaign brochure. Like, let's do it. So, I have for a long time supported veterans running for office because I believe that a predisposition to serve your country before your party is going to tell me that you're going to serve your country before your party. So I'm very interested in veterans running. So I've been really trying to get him to do it, but I'll connect the two of you. Maybe you can convince him.
Yeah, or I might convince him not to. Be careful. So,
well, if you convince him not to, we'll be in the same position we're in now. So I sort of feel like there's no loss. Yes. Yeah. Diana, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say, that feeling like I don't need to go to therapy. I don't need to go see somebody. That never leaves. Like, even after writing the book, we still to each other are like, you should go, but I don't need to go still now. And so we actually made a marital pact. When the other person says, I think you should make an appointment with your therapist, the other person can't argue. They just have to do it. And I think it's important to have at least one person in your life that gets to call that appointment.
I love that. Because I think we see all the time people who have all sorts of, brain chemistry, mental health, any sort of issues, even anxiety and depression with like a little lowercase a and a lowercase d, right? If it's not even capital case. We think we do the stuff, we take the medication, we go to therapy, we think we're fine. So then we stop the medication, we stop the therapy, and then it's like, boom, rebound. And I love that you have this pact where you can just call the other person out and you just have to go, because you can't see the picture when you're inside the frame.
It's not unlike any other injury, like a physical injury, right? Like, I always compare it to, for me to go into the Army, I had to get surgery and physical therapy on my knee.
Right.
But what I compare what I did with my mental health to is it's as if I just went into the Army without getting my knee repaired. And I spent, all those years doing, 15, 16-mile ruck marches and 5-mile runs and all that stuff. At the end of that time, like my leg would be totally mangled and useless, right? Well, that's what I did with my mental health is I waited, forever, and I just kept putting it off, and it just got way worse than it needed to be. And if I just treated it initially, well, now it's like a physical injury in that, like, I still have an injured knee, but like I can run. I just, I ice it after. I have a brace that I wear on my knee, but it doesn't stop me from running. And now, like sometimes I go see my therapist, or I do other things to make sure that I work out. I do things to maintain my mental health, but I have to remember to do that maintenance. Otherwise, like any other injury, it starts to act up.
So I'm interested in how you being out there and your messaging and talking is being absorbed, I hope, by the military. So my son is not in ROTC, but he was going to be in ROTC. So he just finished his freshman year at Rice University, and he went his very first day as an Air Force ROTC cadet. That was the plan. The night before we flew to drop him off at college, he got an email from DODMER, right, the Department of Defense Medical Exam Review Board, for people who don't know, a billion acronyms in the military. And even though he had already gotten the scholarship, and even though he'd gotten a scholarship for like full ride for a private university, like the big top, big thing, they sent him a note saying, yeah, so it turns out you're actually not qualified because you have history of anxiety disorders, parentheses, general. So when he was in second grade, he had a teacher who was a little bit of a bully, and he started getting a little anxious. And so I was like, well, we should figure this out. We should see what's going on. I don't know what's happening. He was a boy. So he, the teacher was like, he's got ADHD. He can't sit still. He needs medication. And I was like, well, maybe, but you're not a doctor. So let me take him to somebody. So we took him to a psychologist. He had maybe 3 or 4 appointments. They were like, he doesn't have ADHD. He's a boy who doesn't have a fully formed brain. And he's just a little anxious right now, but his brain's not fully formed. So that's all going to be fine. Okay, so this is in his records. He applies. We do the whole ROTC thing. We're honest as the day is long. So we're like, yes, he saw somebody once. Again, when he was 7 years old. So he applies. We get he's in, he gets the scholarship. And then we get this the night before we're going to bring him to college. Terrible. Okay, first of all, if we couldn't afford to send him to college, I don't know what we would have done. Thank God that we were able to do that. So he applies. He starts going through the process to apply for a waiver. And at this point, he's nervous. He's like, even if I get the medical waiver, it's going to say asterisk, right? So like, will I get to fly? Do I get to be a fighter pilot? Do I get to be a test pilot? Am I going to get to be an astronaut? The things he wants to do. And he decides not to do it because here's what he learns. You can get a medical waiver if you either A, have not had treatment for the last 2 years, or you have not been medicated for the last 2 years. Now, he hadn't had treatment at this point for 10 years, and he'd never been medicated. But what he took from that was the military is telling me that if ever I do have this issue, I should shut the hell up and not tell anybody.
Yeah, that's right.
That's terrifying.
Oh, it's horrible, because what it means is that there's just a lot of people who are like, I can't get treated. So like I've seen a lot of that same sort of stuff, right? In my world that I was in the intelligence world, it was instead of it being the threat like of you won't get to fly, the threat was you'll get your security clearance pulled, so that you won't be able to continue in your career. So that keeps people from doing it. It also happens in the law enforcement world. Here's a wild story, right? So the place where I work now, I'm the president of national expansion at a place called Veterans Community Project. And we're a national nonprofit that serves veterans around the country in a variety of ways. One of the co-founders of Veterans Community Project, what happened with him was he came back from Afghanistan. He got hurt over there. He came back and he was, I think, at like 30%. The VA considered him 30% disability for PTSD. It was something pretty low. And he did what a lot of vets do. It may not be their first choice, but it's the job that's available to a lot of them. He applied to be a police officer in his hometown outside of Kansas City. And he went to the police department and they looked at his records and they said, hey, look, you're totally qualified. We take you. The problem is that your records say that you have PTSD. They didn't say so we need to get you treatment, and then once you get through treatment, then we'll go ahead and send you to the academy. They said,
Like you had to with your knee, right? You have to get your knee in shape before you go. This is just mental.
What they said was, you got to go back to the VA and you got to get them to change it to say you don't have PTSD and get your disability down to 0%, or just remove PTSD because he had a physical disability from getting hurt. They're like, at least just get the PTSD part removed from your disability rating. So he goes back and he's like, hey, I'd like to get reevaluated. So they reevaluate him. He answers all the questions honestly. He comes back with 100% disability for PTSD.
Oh my goodness.
And so he goes through treatment and everything. He can't get accepted to the police department, so he co-founds an organization that now is changing people's lives all over the country. To me, the point of that story is twofold. One, thank goodness that happened because it helped a lot of people in the long run. But two, how many people are in jobs like that who are just like, they have PTSD, but what they got taken care of was that the records no longer say it and they never got treated? That's not good.
It's not good. And what I said to my son was, you're somebody who had this experience. You went to a psychologist, you learned to like self-soothe and scaffold and notice when it's happening and figure out what you need.
Right.
And the military should be actively recruiting people like you who can notice this in others, right? If he's going to be somebody who's going to become an officer, he's going to lead other people. So I'm sort of curious if what you're hearing from your friends in the military, if they're like, this is great, I'm so glad you're bringing light to this, keep talking about it. If they're like, well, maybe like, this is your experience, but it's not universal. I mean, are you getting any cheering or blowback or anything from this?
There's no blowback. There's two different versions of what I hear, and you should jump in on this too, because you hear about from people too. Like the first is before people read the book or hear like a long interview with me, they'll be curious and they'll be like, I think maybe I've experienced some of that. And they'll universally be like, it's really important. They may not see it in themselves yet, like I was, but they see it in people around them and in like their soldiers who they care about. So they'll be grateful and they'll express appreciation for what I've done. But then if they read the book or hear like a long form interview with me, mostly if they read the book, I've had several of them who I sent it to, like early drafts, read the book and then be like, yeah, I'm going to go to the VA now. Like, it turns out I need to do this. And that's really gratifying for me.
Jason says that the stats are that 1 in 5 Americans have experienced trauma.
I saw that somewhere. Yeah.
And this is my non-scientific experience, but I feel like every person experiences trauma 5 times in their lives. Like the statistics that we have are horribly underrepresenting what's happening in this country. I feel like we all experience a PTSD from COVID, especially healthcare and frontline workers going through the airport right now. You can tell that everyone who works at an airline is having a really difficult time. And I just wish more and more people understood that what they were going through was like a totally normal experience and there is a way to treat it and get through it.
That's why we wrote the book.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I was at a restaurant last night, and you could just tell the waitress. The people are short staffed, and every table she walked up to, she knew things were late. She knew that things weren't right, and you could just tell she was girding herself to be yelled at by patrons. You could just feel her anxiety, and I just wanted to reach out and hug her and be like, it's fine. I'm happy to eat the lamb chops, even though I ordered the steak. Not a big deal. I don't really care. I'm sitting here at a beautiful restaurant and a beautiful night in Boston, Massachusetts. It's cool. Like, don't worry. So I am curious, Diana, if spouses are reaching out to you in the same way that soldiers have reached out to Jason. Do you hear from people that are like, yeah, how do I bring this up?
Yeah, a lot of people, a lot of family members, mental health never affects one person. It affects an entire family, always. And there's so many people who are struggling without an idea of what to do. And I think that my viewpoint in the book is like all the ways not to do it. That's how I feel about it. I feel like I did it wrong for 12 years. So please learn from that.
Yeah, me too. The first 2 acts of the book are just
how not to do it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, everybody writes a book because they needed that book, right? I mean, I love how you said, like, I wrote this book because the book didn't exist. If this book was here 10 years ago, I might not have been in this situation. And people ask me why I wrote my last book, Limitless. And I'm like, because I needed it, right? I needed it. And so you do spend the first couple acts of every book being like, here are all the wrong ways. But, the way that you insert your point of view throughout the book, Diana, is it's so lovely, and it's I mean, sometimes you saw things completely differently. The facts were different. Like even the senior prom story is hilarious. Where you like, I saw her in this debate program, and I just captivated from the moment. And Diana's like, well, his other date, got suspended for smoking pot, so she couldn't be there, and he needed so it was really cute because it really feels like a real marriage. It's not just you being like, well, and here's some platitudes. Like it's actual. The way that you insert your experience comes from a place that I read the book, then I handed it to my husband. And I was like, I'm sort of curious during last year if Diana's point of view, if you felt any of that when I was, having so much trouble. And so he's starting to read it now, and
Oh,
I'll
that's cool.
report back.
When we were working on it, and I would, give her a section that I'd written, and then she would be writing her contribution to it, because there's, as there's one or two passages from her in each chapter.
Yes.
She was referring to it, I think, at least half jokingly at the time as she was writing her rebuttals.
Well,
We're
so I'm
debaters,
curious.
we're high school debaters, so
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. You went back. So I'm curious how that came about. Was that always the plan in the book, or as you were giving her the book, she was commenting, you're like, that would actually be useful?
Go ahead.
no, that was the plan from the very beginning. And actually, we have this really funny story. Pop, who's Jason's grandfather, who's prominently featured in the book, we just both had such a close relationship with him, and we had this idea for the book. And Pop was in hospice, and he was like barely talking at the time. And we came to spend time with him, and we were explaining the book to him, and we were kind of going back and forth like we are in this interview. And we were like, so it's both of our perspectives, Pop. Like, and he just lay there. He didn't say anything. And I said, just like now, like we're doing it live right here. And he goes, no, I got it. And we just both cracked up. He's like, no, I get what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think also the kernel of it, where it started, was we wrote this article. It was the first thing we had really written publicly about what we'd learned. And we wrote a short article that was sort of, my point of view followed by her point of view, talking about certain parts of trauma. And it just received a huge reception. And we heard from so many people who were like, this really helped me understand, and it helped me understand some things I've been through, and I think I'm going to address it. And so then when I was ready to write the memoir, I just couldn't envision us doing it any other way. So, I'd say 90% of the voice in the book, 85, 90 is me. But I think people's favorite parts are the other 10 or 15%.
That's how I like it. I like to leave on a high note. If I stayed any longer, it wouldn't be as good. So.
No, I mean, it just adds just enough context that you're like, okay, I get this, because not a lot of people can relate to. And there I was on the campaign trail about to, win handily the mayorship of Kansas City, or I was, one of the favorite candidates for the presidency, or, I mean, like, not a lot of people can relate to that. But when Diana puts her context in, you're like, oh yeah, okay, it's a totally relatable story. I can see myself in it. So that helps a lot, I think.
I do too. And I think that the other part that's hard to relate to is, and I think it's an important writing device that I used in the book, is that, and both of us did, is that as you go through, the story chronologically, what we didn't do was use language that we have since learned in therapy. We sort of limited ourselves as the narrator to what we understood at the time. So, for say like a year after I get back and I'm trying to explain to you what I felt like, to you, the reader, what I felt like, and what the insomnia felt like, what the night terrors and the hypervigilance felt like. I didn't have those words for it at the time. So I'm explaining, like, I have these nightmares and I feel like I'm in danger a lot. And as the reader, without her perspective, I think you might be inclined to be like, why does this guy not understand that he needs help, right? And so you need another person who is there to come in and be like, to give you context as to what they were seeing with me, what she was experiencing herself, and to really help you understand the whole world as it was at that time.
That's really interesting, because I didn't notice that I was going through the book. I didn't notice that you weren't using the language, and I was so terrified for you earlier on and felt calmer as the book went on, because you were calmer and you knew more. And I didn't realize you were doing that. That's so clever,
Yeah,
but I really felt it as you went through the book
We
because you
felt
did that.
we felt like the reader needed to go on the journey that we went on, but in a way that wasn't quite as upsetting.
But it was super hard to do because there's so many things that happened where you wish you could sit there and be like, let me stop the story and explain it. So for instance, Jason goes door to door, knocking on doors, and he finds out that somebody he recently served with has died in a single vehicle car accident. And he thinks in the book, like, that's weird. And we want to like stop and shake you and say a lot of single vehicle car accidents of people who are service members are suicides in disguise. And there's a lot of research to prove that. And like, these are all undiagnosed PTSD cases that we need to be paying attention to more and more. And it was hard not to do that.
Yeah, we got to make you wait to figure it out when we figured it out.
Yeah. And it's I will also say the book is funny. I know that's a weird thing to say, but you're hilarious.
We're pretty funny. Look,
you're both very funny. I mean, there were literally lines where I read the book from start to finish in one sitting. It's just so good. But there were lines where I literally laughed out loud, and my husband would look over at me. He's like, "Aren't you reading a book about war and politics and PTSD?" And I'm like, "But it's funny. I'm also reading a book about family and love and service, and it's funny."
Yeah, look, I mean, there's two reasons it's funny. One, if you're gonna get people to take this medicine, there's got to be sugar with it, right? I mean, you got to make it a fun and enjoyable read, or I mean, people aren't going to read it. And then the second reason is, look, I got through the military, and then 11 years afterwards, and more than that, I guess, still today with gallows humor. That's what I learned in the military, and so, there's plenty of that.
The book says it's about serving and politics, but my favorite review said that it's a love story, about two kids who got together when they were 17 and went through this entire life together, and a huge chunk of it was PTSD, and now life post PTSD. And
can you be post PTSD? That's interesting.
It's I guess it's not post PTSD. It's we always refer to it as going from post traumatic stress disorder to post traumatic growth.
Yes.
And so that's where we are now is, like you got PTSD, but like, about it, you got the tools, and, now it's a different part of your life.
Yeah, because there's always, it's sort of like people who haven't had a drink in 50 years still call themselves alcoholics, right? Like it's just always something that's there and you think about, but I would imagine that the lens shifts from an inward lens to an outward lens in some way, which is, I think, part of why you're doing this book.
Well, and it's also, to go back to the physical injury analogy, it's the way in which it departs from the physical injury analogy, right? Which is like, you could break your arm, you get it set, later on, you don't have a broken arm. But injuries like PTSD, at least in my case, they're based on memories. The memories don't go away. The experiences don't go away. So the PTSD doesn't go away. But, you get to a point where it doesn't disrupt your life.
And the voice inside your head, you understand, is not your voice. The voice that says the dumb things and the mean things, you understand, is PTSD. And when you can create that kind of space, it changes everything.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I know we just have a few minutes left. I do want to ask you to talk a little bit about VCP. Veterans Community Project, because it is such a wonderful organization, and you tell a great story in the book about seeing a homeless person on the street and giving him $1. And I'd love for you to tell that story and talk a little bit about VCP, because it's just it is so emblematic to me of the love story that the two of you have for each other and how you're raising your children in that love story.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. Veterans Community Project, I'll start by explaining the organization. Veterans Community Project is based in Kansas City, where we are, and it was started by a handful of combat veterans. This predates my involvement with it. So started by a handful of combat veterans who looked at the system as it is for veterans, and said, we can do what the VA should do, which is anybody who served, no qualifiers, qualify for 100% of our services, boom. And so that's what they did. They started a walk-in center that was serving thousands of veterans a year, with everything from, mental health to dentistry, to like getting veterinarians to come in and help take care of folks' dogs, because that's so expensive, to people who cut your hair, to fix your car, to financial literacy training, everything.
Everything.
And then that was very successful. So they said, well, why are all these veterans still on the street? And that's what we're best known for at Veterans Community Project. What they ended up doing was creating a village of tiny houses with wraparound case management services to serve as transitional housing for homeless veterans. And we do this with an 85% success rate, which is sort of unheard of in the homeless transition area, like space. So that's the short version on the organization. I toured it in 2018 when I was running for mayor, and I remember coming home and telling Diana that, like, I just wish I could quit everything and go work there. But it was not a realistic notion in my life at that moment, right? I was running for office, that kind of thing. 6 weeks later, I end up in the suicide hold at the emergency department at the VA. And one of the things they were telling me was it was going to be 4 or 5 months before I could get enrolled in the system to start getting weekly therapy. So I call over to Veterans Community Project and they say, come on down. So I go through the outreach center, they expedite my paperwork, and a week later I start weekly therapy at the VA. So I'm a big believer at that point anyway. And around this time, communities around the country were reaching out to VCP and saying, can you do here what you did in Kansas City? And I had created a national organization before. So a few months after, I started therapy, I'm doing much better. I'm hanging around Veterans Community Project. And they were like, hey man, why don't you just come here full time and help us with this national expansion thing? So for the last 3 years, I've been the president of national expansion. We've expanded to the Denver area, to St. Louis, to Sioux Falls, to Oklahoma City, and we're going to keep going. The story, to get to your point from the book.
I mean, it's a whole other wonder hell, right? That's the whole other one where it's like, someone's got to do it. Who can do it? Like, I'm a veteran. I understand the issue. I was helped by the organization. I have a national platform, right? I have all this access. Like, it's got to be someone. Maybe it should be me.
Well, look, a lot of former elected officials cash out for different things. I just had the poor judgment to cash out on behalf of homeless veterans.
Yeah, that's not a lucrative. That's not a lucrative situation, Jason.
Yeah, it's not a big money client, but
not a big money client. So the story.
So all those years that I was running for office and doing all those things, my son, our son, True, he understood that as daddy flies on airplanes. Like, that's what he didn't really understand what Let America Vote was, or what, now he gets, like, dad almost ran for president. He was going to be mayor or whatever. But that stuff didn't, like, make him think like, like, I'm really proud of my dad. Right. It was just, my dad's not here.
Yes.
But he loves VCP. Like, he goes down to VCP with me and he knows everybody, and he meets new veterans when they move into the village. Particularly pre-COVID, that's what we would do. And so one day, toward the end of when I was writing the book, actually, which is how it got included in the book, he and I were sitting at a stoplight, and I was just kind of zoned out, looking right straight through the windshield. And there was a guy in the median next to us, a homeless guy with a sign. And True sitting in the back seat, and he's like, Dad, do we have $1? It was wintertime. He was like, Dad, do we have $1 we can give that guy? So I looked through the center console and I find one, and I rolled in the window and I give the guy $1. And as we're pulling away, I say to True, hey, buddy, that was great. I wasn't even going to notice him. What made you think to want to give him $1? And he's like, well, it's going to be really cold tonight, and he doesn't have a house. He said, and he had on an army jacket. And, I think he might be an army man, and helping army men who don't have houses, that's what you do. And obviously that was like a very emotional moment for me, because, every father wants their son or daughter to understand more about them and what it is they do. And for him to feel like that's what you do, like, that's good. I can go through my whole life feeling like that's what my son thinks I do.
And all of our royalties from the book go to VCP. So
amazing.
Buy 10 copies.
Yeah.
So buy 10 copies, buy 100 copies. The book is called Invisible Storm, a soldier's memoir of politics and PTSD. The organization is called Veterans Community Project, and it can be found at veteranscommunityproject.org. And I would encourage anybody who is listening to buy the book, to donate to the organization, to tell your elected officials to bring it to your town, and to reach out to Jason, because if you reach out to Jason as the head of national expansion, he may show up in your town and have a book reading and talk about the organization. Everybody wins.
That's right.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Laura.
Okay, we'll talk soon.
All right.
Bye.